We must not get caught up in direct comparisons between plants, animals, and human beings, or between plant animal ecosystems and human communities. None of these is completely congruent with another. We would be regressing in our views of those of Park, Burgess, and Mackenzie, not to mention our current bouquet of sociologists, where we lack enough to make this equation. It is not in the particulars of differentiation, what plant animal communities are ecologically united with human communities, but rather in the logic of differentiation. Wholeness, in fact, is completeness. The dynamic stability of the whole derives from a visible levels of completeness in human communities as in climax ecosystems. What unites these modes of wholeness and completeness, however, different they are in their specificity and their qualitative distinctness, is the logic of development itself. A climax forest is whole and complete as a result of the same unifying process, the same dialectic, that a particular social form is whole and complete. When wholeness and completeness are viewed as a result of an immanent dialectic within phenomena, we do not we do no more violence to the uniqueness of these phenomena than the principle of gravity does violence to the uniqueness of objects that fall within its lawfulness. In this sense, the ideal of human roundedness, a product of the rounded community, is the legitimate heir to the ideal of a stabilized nature, a product of a rounded natural environment. Marx tried to root humanity's identity and self-discovery in its productive interactions with nature. But I must add that not only does humanity place its imprint on the natural world and transform it, but also nature places its imprint on the human world and transforms it. To use the language of hierarchy against itself, it is not only we who tame nature, but also nature that tames us. These turns of phrase should be taken as more than metaphors, lest it seem that I have rarefied the concept of wholeness into an abstract dialectical principle. Let me note that natural ecosystems and human communities interact with each other in very existential ways. Sorry. Our animal nature is never so distant from our social nature that we can remove ourselves from the organic world outside us and the one within us. From our embryonic development to our layered brain, we partially recapitulate our own natural evolution. We are not so remote from our primate ancestry that we can ignore its physical legacy in our stereoscopic vision, acute, acuity of intelligence, and grasping fingers. We phase into society as individuals in the same way that society, phasing out of nature, comes into itself. These continuities, to be sure, are obvious enough. What is often less obvious, is the extent to which nature itself is realm of potentiality for the emergence of social differentia. Nature is as much a precondition for the development of society, not merely its emergence, as techniques, labors, language, and mind. Nature is as much a precondition of the development of society, not merely its emergence, as techniques, labor, language, and mind. And it is a precondition not merely in William's petty sense. What if labor is the father of wealth, nature is the mother? This formula, so clear, so dear to Marx, actually slights nature by imparting to it the patriarchal notion of feminine passivity. Hmm. The affinities between nature and society are more active than we care to admit. Very specific forms of nature, very specific ecosystems constitute the ground for very specific forms of society. At the risk of using a highly embattled phrase, I might say that a historical materialism of natural development could be written that would transform passive nature, the object of human labor, into active nature, the creator of human labor. Labor's metabolism with nature cuts both ways, so that nature interacts with humanity to yield the actualization of their common potentialities in the natural and social world. An interaction of this kind, in which terms like father and mother strike a false note, can be stated very concretely, can be stated very concretely. The recent emphasis on bioregions as frameworks for various human communities provides a strong case for the need to readapt techniques and work style to accord with the requirements and possibilities to particular ecological areas. Bioregional requirements and possibilities place a heavy burden on humanity's claim of sovereignty over nature and autonomy from its needs. If it is true that men make history, but not under conditions of their own choosing, Marx, is it no less true that history makes society, but not under conditions of its own choosing? The hidden dimension that lurks in the word play, sorry, the hidden dimension that lurks in the word, the hidden dimension that lurks in the word play with Marx's famous formula is the natural history that enters into the making of social history, but an active, concrete, existential nature that emerges from stage to stage of its own ever more complex development in the form of equally complex and dynamic ecosystems. Our ecosystems, in turn, are interlinked in highly dynamic and complex bioregions. How concrete the hidden dimension of social development is, and how much humanity's claims to sovereignty must defer to it, has only recently become evident from our need to design an alternative technology that is as adaptive to a bioregion as it is productive to society. Hence, our concept of wholeness is not a finished tapestry of natural and social relations that we can exhibit to the hungry eyes of sociologists. It is a fecund natural history, ever active and ever changing. The way childhood presses towards and is absorbed into youth, and youth into adulthood. The need to bring sense of history into nature is as compelling as the need to bring sense of history into society. An ecosystem is never a random community of plants and animals that occur merely by chance. It has potentiality, direction, meaning, and self realization in its own right. To view an ecosystem as given, a bad habit which scientism inculcates in its theoretically neutral observer, is as ahistorical and superficial as to view a human community as given. To view an ecosystem as given is as ahistorical and superficial as to view a human community as given. Both have a history that gives intelligibility and order to their internal relationships and directions to their development. At its inception, human history is largely natural history as well as social, as traditional kinship structures and the sexual division of labor clearly indicates. Whether or not natural history is the slime, to use Sartre's maladroit term, that cling to humanity and prevents its rational fulfillment will be considered later. For the present, one fact would be made clear. Human history can never disengage itself or disembed itself from nature. It will always be embedded in nature, as we shall see, whether we are inclined to call that nature a slime or a fecund mother. What may prove to be the most demanding test of our human genius is the kind of nature we will foster. One that is richly organic and complex, or one that is inorganic and disastrously simplified. Humanity's involvement with nature not only runs deep, but takes on forms more increasingly subtle than ever, than ever the most sophisticated theorist could ever anticipate. Our knowledge of this involvement is still, as it were, in its prehistory. To Ernest Bloch, we not only share a common history with nature, all the differences between nature and society aside, but also a common destiny, as he observes. Nature in its final manifestation, like history in its final manifestation, lies at the horizon of the future. The more common technique is attainable instead of one that is external, one that is mediated with the co-productivity of nature. The more we can be sure that the frozen powers of a frozen nature will again be emancipated. Nature is not something that can be cognized to the past. Rather, it is the construction site that has not yet been cleared, the building tools that have not yet been attained in an adequate form for the human house that itself does not yet exist in an adequate form. The ability of problem-laden natural subjectivity to participate in the construction of this house is the objective utopian correlate of the human utopian fantasy conceived in concrete terms. Therefore, it is certain that the human house stands not only in history and on the ground of human activity, it stands primarily on the ground of a mediated natural subjectivity on the construction site of nature. Nature's conceptual frontier is not the beginning of human history, where nature, which is always present in history and always surrounds it, turns into the site of the human sovereign realm, but rather where it turns into the adequate site for the adequate human house as an unalienated, mediated good. One can take issue with the emphasis Bloch gives to human sovereignty in the interaction with nature and the structural phraseology that infiltrates his brilliant grasp of the organic nature of that interaction. Das Prinzip Hoffnung, the principle of hope, was written in the early 40s, a grim and embattled period, when such a conceptual framework was totally alien to the anti-naturalistic, indeed militaristic spirit of the times. His insight beggars our hindsight, redolent with its pop ecological terminology and its queasy mysticism. In any case, enough has been written about the differences between nature and society. Today, together with Bloch, it would be valuable to shift our emphasis to the commonalities of nature and society, provided we are wary enough to avoid these mindless leaps from the one to the other, as though they were not related by the rich phases of development that authentically unite them. Nice. That was quite a bit. What are you making out of all of this?
Um, the first half was a little hard to grasp conceptually. Um, but I think that the point is that um, we tend to separate them and like focus on the differences and interpret like humanity impacting nature, like we are the root, when in reality, I think the main sentence that struck me is the recent emphasis on bioregions as frameworks for various human communities provides a strong case for the need to readapt techniques and work styles to accord with the requirements and possibilities of particular ecological areas. And something that I've been thinking a lot about is the fact that, uh, we focus on culture and like these little differences between our societies, even in geographical areas where we are like these societies are both from. And in reality, geography and nature shapes a people. Um, so I think that's, from my understanding, is where it was leading.
Yeah, yeah, I think you're completely right. I think he just took like instead of just saying it, I think he's very careful in he's trying to kind of elaborate a much more um, philosophically sound framework to what he's going to explore for the rest of the book and avoiding all kinds of existing pitfalls. So he says, on one hand, we have like the complete um, separateness in which we have been observing nature versus human societies. He mentioned at some point uh, which I find very interesting, that he brought in the kind of patriarchal line that was still kind of present even in Marx's brilliant analysis, which he said um, that if labor is the father of wealth, nature is the mother, which gives nature this kind of passivity. So, on one hand, he mentions the pitfall of how kind of material, scientific, he called scientism. I've never heard that term, but that sees the view of an ecosystem as given, and of course anthropomorphism and all this kind of hierarchical stuff that we are exploring throughout the book. But on the other hand, we can also fall into the pitfall of, and this is the first part that he's kind of starting with, we should not get caught up in direct comparison between plants, animal, and human beings as well. So it's not just deconstructing the kind of separateness of human society from nature, but also avoiding the direct comparison between the two. Because if we learn anything from history as an ecological dialectic process, is that things are very much, the whole of reality engages in this world making that arises from the very relationality of things. So nothing is passive. So we should avoid this kind of, not just the anthropomorphic separateness and hierarchy, but also the kind of patriarchal comparison that makes nature into this passive mother, right? Which I find
Mhm.
really interesting that you brought it up specifically from this perspective of patriarchy, which just makes me appreciate him more, like being very, very deeply, like coming into this ecological conversation from a very deconstructive lens, which I love personally. Um, but also it reminds me of Al-Khibri's work and how she traces theorizes the traces of patriarchy back to the kind of um, primordial sense of envy um, that the male
Mhm.
experiences,
Mhm.
witnessing the female being able to bleed with and all that kind of stuff, which turned into the separating himself from the process of life, from the process of giving birth, and created this whole thing of legacy and creating things that lasts and trying to live forever and all this kind of stuff. And I think this is very connected. Like she says that the whole idea of mother nature is part of that patriarchal sense that separates the male from the ecological process of creation, of participation with nature. And so I think this is what it opens with. Like, be careful with this kind of
Mhm.
direct comparison and looking at nature as like a passive thing. Um, if I understand it correctly.
Yeah, um, that definitely makes sense. And I think I really love that he again brings everything that he talks about into a balanced perspective where we're focusing on commonalities, but don't forget we're subject to binary thinking, and some comparisons aren't valid. And I think that's so important to point out because a lot of arguments will actually use that and weaponize it. Like you said, uh, the, like the wild aspect of nature, how we're all animals and how, um, all animals have aggression within their systems, which like may be true, and maybe that's one of the worthy comparisons. I don't know. That's just an example. But I do think that that is like used as an argument a lot, especially like validating toxic patriarchal behavior and stuff like that. And it's always used in a very binary comparison, like direct comparison.
Yeah.
So yeah, I definitely understand that. And I think it's also very ironic because sometimes I forget that gendering things like nature, calling it mother, and all of that is supposed to be in like an underhanded kind of like um, push to invalidate the strength that the female energy possesses. And um, I haven't delved into the past of like the way that the patriarchy had created its roots, but what you described makes perfect sense to me, where it is actually the power and I mean, to create life is something to envy, you know? And even that as a direct comparison, like, isn't necessarily valid in nature because there are certain species where it's the, you know, sexually male uh, giving life. But that also makes sense. I just think it's sometimes I forget that we do have to look at things from the patriarchal point of view to be able to understand how to unite um, the discrepancies that our society has been kind of forced with in relation to male versus female, which like in general is such a human concept, labeling things like that when it's so much more complex than like one or the other. Um,
And it's also
so
it's uniting without diminishing the differentiation. That's the
yeah.
complex part that people find very hard to grasp. And I think in general we are conditioned and socialized to think in these like binary ways. Like, it's either the kind of concepts of patriarchy, in which male domination in all of these varied ways, or we are exactly the same. And
Hmm.
I think this is why I love that he brought like mentioned the patriarchal parts, because I feel like it's very appropriate here, because he's trying to elaborate a similar more nuanced, more grounded view of ecology and social ecologies that is neither, oh, it's exactly the same, like humans are like plants, very reductive, very wrong, very ahistorical, takes away completely all the differentiation, all the wholeness in multiplicity, in diversity that he was elaborating before. And at the same time, we don't want to fall into the pitfall, on the other hand, of hierarchizing nature and making nature into this mother nature, into this patriarchal passivity, as if we are not, as human societies, are not both part of nature but also a product of nature that is constantly being produced and changed by nature and changing nature in return in this like co-evolution ad infinitum, you know? So you see, like, the need to bring a sense of history into nature is as compelling as the need to bring sense of history into society. He's basically elaborating something that can be akin to saying we have to start seeing everything as processes rather than finalities,
Yeah,
identities. An ecosystem is
it
never
really, yeah.
random. Yeah, go on.
No, 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 go ahead.
No, it's just like I think this sentence is kind of like the point of the whole thing. So an ecosystem is never a random community of plants and animals that occurs merely by chance. It has potentiality, direction, meaning, and self-realization in its own right. To view an ecosystem as a given is as ahistorical and superficial as to view a human community as given, which I think speaks directly, if not like explicitly, he's saying like, yeah, look at all of these things as a process, as a thing that has potentiality, direction, meaning, and self-realization. But I think he's also implying here what I said just a few sentences ago, that any kind of sense of finality or identity, whether individual or social group identity, is in a sense falling into one of these pitfalls. I find it really interesting, like this really trying to find like how on one hand we explore our inseparability from the natural world all around us without collapsing the very unique phenomena that we are as social ecology.
Yeah. And I think it continuously just comes back to this patriarchal colonialist tendency to create a binary of things and not see the processes. It's harder if if like, and that translates into all of these conflicts right now, well, conflicts with the occupation and all of that, the way that people interpret, oh, if you're criticizing this, then you are opposing that. It's like a this or that pattern, and that prevents us seeing the processes that are very they're all intertwined, all both diverse and similar, and it's all so much more dynamic um, than we'll ever understand, probably. But at the very least, we can understand um, that concept, that it's all interrelated.
Yeah. Yeah, also like, and I keep doing this in these readings, but it's because um, I'm simultaneously reading this book, but also really exploring the works of Deleuze, both Deleuze and Guattari, but also Deleuze himself. So I'm now reading The Logic of Sense, which is a phenomenal work of how basically exploring how things come to make sense. Um,
Oh, that sounds great.
yeah. So a lot of the it's a lot about linguistics, especially all the first half of the book, of course, and a lot about paradoxes. And he's using mainly the work of Lewis Carroll, especially Alice in Wonderland and some other works, to explore many of these kind of paradoxes that are inherent to language. And what I was reading actually today was something that I feel very connected to something that he mentioned here about the view of history as this kind of basically, I don't remember where it was exactly, but not as a set of separable events that lead into each other, but as like a continuum, that continual process that has its own, that is constantly recreating, creating through the entanglement new potentialities. I don't remember where it was, but it said it like something about past and future. I'm gonna try to find it, but basically what Deleuze was talking about is how, well, the last couple of series there is that basically separating these two views of time. One is the kind of normal way in which we see time, called chronos, which is like there is always only present, and it's like an infinite sets of presents that create this sense of a past moving towards a future, the arrow of time. And then there is what he's elaborating, which is part of the logic of sense, because sense doesn't have that. There is like multiple paradoxes that they are talking about, but exemplifying how really there is no such thing as present. Things are always just happen or about to happen. So it's basically an infinitum that flows past future, but also um, vice versa. So it's more of a surface. It's something that doesn't have an altitude or depth, a height or depth or a particular, yeah, basically depth like bodies have, but rather it's a surface. So he gives us an example from physics how, in the perspective of the cosmos itself, there is no such thing as a past moving towards a future in a
Mhm.
linear way, right? Like there is always only a surface in which there is no up and down
Yeah.
in the universe, right? What is it?
No, I was just agreeing. It's the fourth dimension.
Yeah, there is no up and down, there is no past and front. Things are just happening at the surface. And so that surface, and I think this is what Deleuze is elaborating continuously throughout his work, that surface is where is the processes that are happening, where we exist as a process, not as the so-called subjective, a depth, the inner world, but rather always at the surface, always in relation to other things, other plugged into other machines, always entangled in a becoming, infinite becoming, how we call it. And I think this concept is very, very connected to what he's talking about here. Looking at social ecology, human history, natural history, the natural world, the ecology, all of these kind of machines are entangled, intermingled in each other in an infinite process of becoming that is constantly creating itself imminently, rather than these separable concepts or separable dimensions that are neither completely collapsed into one thing, like some kind of unified oneness, and neither infinitely separable, um, in a sense that one emerges from the other in a hierarchical fashion. Like human society emerged from nature, and it's like an elaboration on nature rather than it's all happening at the surface as a continuum without depth, without height, without past to future. Um, yeah, it's very interesting to kind of read these both seemingly random works separately, but also they're very, very connected with each other, and they're both kind of um, elaborating very material and at the same time very metaphysical, but try kind of perspective, but trying to get away from mysticism. Um,
Hmm.
and I find it very interesting. I don't know if they knew about each other, but
Well, I think that in I don't know about what was it? The nature of logic. What was it?
the logic of sense.
Logic of sense. But I do find that people who think in this context of like everything is both separate and together tend to overlap in ideologies, because I don't know if we can call them truths, but there are certain uniting perspectives around that. And I do find that physics has a lot of input into understanding that aspect. I'll have to read about the way that he describes the surface. The way that I'm used to thinking about it is, um, you know, like it's the fourth dimension time, and the reason why we don't feel it as its wholeness and like the natural evolution is because we are on that dimension. We are moving with it.
Mm.
And we're not able to see it from that third person perspective. So it seems like we're moving into the future and the past, and there's this present because we're perceiving it. Um, but in reality, everything is in a ever-flowing ecosystem, um, that is always changing, and like you said, builds upon itself from our perspective because we are experiencing time. When in reality, it's all, at least according to like theoretical physics, it's all happening at once. And so it's very interesting to see how inevitably it all does come together and overlaps, even though, like you said, it seems like two completely random, you know, um, theorists talking about different things when uh, it's, like he said, both intertwined and distinct.
Yeah, just like the works that they are trying to elaborate.
Yeah,
um,
yeah, like it's all is so representative, and it's also like the relativity of it.
yeah, there is a phenomenal series of talks that I highly recommend that is very connected to this whole notion of time. It's called At the End of Time,
Mm.
by it's between Krishnamurti and David Bohm. Um, it's available on YouTube, and it's really, really, really incredibly philosophical conversation. It is about all of that.
What was it
Um,
called again?
I think At the End of Time. Let's see if I can find it and put it in the chat.
Yeah, that's definitely something I'd be interested in listening to.
The Ending of Time. Yeah.
This is the first
Mm.
dialogue
Mhm.
between J. Krishnamurti.
Oops. Let me put it in the chat. It's pretty incredible. I really.
Yeah, I love mixing more or less established science with theory because, and I think that's kind of what he does because it creates relevancy to our present in a way that encourages critical thinking and, um, stepping away from that binary thinking.
Yeah. Yeah, this whole talk is exactly about that kind of stuff. Should we continue another paragraph or are we done for today? What do you think?
Um, I don't know.
I'm good either way.
I mean, I'd love to continue, but maybe it is better to cut it shorter. I think that also during the day, it may be difficult to do more than an hour for some people.
Yeah, but just for now, like, how do you feel about
Yeah.
it? Like, do you have the space?
Yeah,
Then let's do
I
one more.
guess I do.
Let's do one more.
Uh,
Spontaneity, yeah, go on.
mhm. Go ahead. No, go ahead.
Spontaneity enters into social ecology in much the same way as it enters into natural ecology, as a function of diversity and complexity. Ecosystems are much too variated to be delivered over completely to what Ernest Bloch called the regum bominis, or at least to humanity's claim of sovereignty over nature. But we may justify, but we may justly ask if this is any less true of social complexity and history's claims of sovereignty over humanity. Do the self-appointed scientists or guardians of society know enough, their normally self-serving view aside, about the complex factors that make for social development to presume to control them? And even after the adequate form of the human house has been discovered and given substantiality, how sure can we be of their disinterested sense of service? History is replete with accounts of miscalculations by leaders, parties, factions, guardians, and vanguards. If nature is blind, society is equally blind when it presumes to know itself completely, whether as social science, social theory, system analysis, or even social ecology. Indeed, world spirits, from Alexander to Lenin, have not always served humanity well. They have exhibited a willful arrogance that has damaged the social environment as disastrously as the arrogance of ordinary men has damaged the natural environment. Great historical eras of transition reveal that the rising flood of social change must be permitted to find its level of spontaneity. Vanguard organizations have produced repeated catastrophes when they sought to force change that people and the conditions of their time could not sustain mentally, ideologically, or morally. Where forced social changes were not nourished by an educated and informed popular consciousness, they were eventually enforced by terror, and the movements themselves have turned savagely upon and devoured their most cherished humanistic and liberatory ideals. Our own century is closing under the shadow of an event that has totally enclosed the future of humanity, notably the Russian Revolution and its terrifying sequels. Where the revolution, unforced and easily achieved by the popular movement, ended and Lenin's coup d'etat of October 1917 replaced it, can be easily fixed and dated. But how the will of the small cadre, abated by the demoralization and stupidity of its opponents, turned success into failure in the very name of success, is more difficult to explain. That the movement would have come to rest Had it been left to its own spontaneous popular momentum and self-determination, possibly with gains that might have reinforced more advanced social development abroad, is perhaps the safest judgment we can make with the hindsight time has given us. Social change, particularly social revolution, tends to find its own worst enemies in leaders whose will supplants the spontaneous movement of the people. Hubris in social evolution is as dangerous as it is in natural evolution, and for the same reasons. In both cases, the complexity of a situation, the limitations of time and place, and the prejudices and the prejudices that, that filter into what often merely appear as foresights conceal the multitude of particulars and are truer to reality than any ideological preconception and needs. Man, he's so delusional. I'm like, I can't. I do not mean to deny the super added significance of will, insight, and knowledge that must inform human spontaneity in the social world. In nature, by contrast, spontaneity operates within a more restrictive set of conditions. A natural ecosystem finds its climax in the greatest degree of stability it can attain within its given level of possibilities. For human societies, it's only different, I would add, just because we are in a capitalist social machine that takes all of these um, boundaries and borders that our societies used to have, so the social codes, and displace them to a point in which seemingly everything is possible. We can just keep going on and on and on. We know, of course, that this is not a passive process, but beyond the level and stability an ecosystem can achieve and the apparent driving it exhibits, it reveals no motivation and choice. Its stability, given its potentialities and what Aristotle called its entelechy, is an end in itself, just as the function of a beehive is to produce bees. A climax ecosystem brings to rest for a time the interrelationships that comprise it. By contrast, the social realm raises the objective possibility of freedom and self consciousness as the superadded function of stability. The human community, at whatever level it comes to rest, remains complete until it achieves remains incomplete until it achieves uninhabited violation. Unin, sorry. The human community, on the other hand, at whatever level it comes to rest, remains incomplete until it achieves uninhabited volition and self-consciousness, or what we call freedom, a complete state, I should add. This is actually the point of departure of new beginnings. How much human freedom rests on the stability of the natural ecosystem in which it always embedded, what it means in a larger philosophical sense beyond mere survival, and what standards it evolves from its shared history with with the entire world of life and its own social history, are subject for the rest of this book. How much human freedom rests on the stability of the natural ecosystem in which it is always embedded, what it means in a larger philosophical sense beyond mere survival, and what standards it evolves from its shared history with the entire world of life and its own social history are subject for the rest of this book. That's interesting. So here is interestingly elaborating on this concept of spontaneity and self-emergence, and how often liberatory movements in the social ecology of humans, of the human realm, are becoming rigidified, um, and turn into, through the kind of willpower and desires and kind of aims of a popular leader or particular kind of um, social formation, new social formation, becomes into repressive, hegemonic, kind of hazardous phenomena even though it started. And maybe
Yeah.
he's trying to elaborate this whole idea of spontaneity as something to look forward to, and elaborate on, which I said before, like he's so Deleuzian because, at the end of Anti-Oedipus, the mutual work of Deleuze and Guattari, they're elaborating this alternative to psychoanalysis, or rather like an evolved version of psychoanalysis, or how to see the unconscious. They call it schizoanalysis. And one of the positive tasks of schizoanalysis is to um, kind of elaborate this perpetual revolution that is not about creating and forming another social form, but rather parting ways with the idea of a cohesive, rigidified social form altogether. And I think this is also what he's kind of elaborating here. And I see the connection between this and the last paragraph that we read, because if everything is a constant process and we are careful of either going to the kind of separative, hierarchized view of man versus nature, neither we are falling to the pitfall of collapsing the difference between social ecology, human societies, and I don't know, other plant communities, for example, then we should at the same time rethink the way that we look at human societies, rather than this a rigid ideological group identity that needs to be reformed in order to form a different type of society, a communist society, for example, as he brings the
Mm-hmm.
Russian Revolution as an example, which always turns to become yet another another version of oppression. And instead, we elaborate this different form of social change and social evolution, and maybe revolution, even though he didn't mention that particular word, as a function of spontaneity that comes from this um, materialistic, entangled, dialectic process that we are constantly engaged in: man, nature, society, plant, animal, ecosystem, all of it. And then he finishes
Yeah.
by elaborating like the questions that will be the subject for the rest of the book. So I think this is pretty good to kind of stay on for a second, which is how much human freedom rests on the stability of the natural ecosystem in which it always embedded, what it means, this kind of the amount of freedom that rests on the stability of the natural ecosystem, what does it mean in a large philosophical sense beyond just survival? Can we survive? What do we need to survive or not? But what does it actually mean? And what standards it evolves from, its shared history with the entire world of life and its own social history as subject for the rest of this book. So, like, basically, what can we learn about human society and our notions of freedom from this kind of dialectical relationship that we have with the natural world? Um, and I think also one thing that was really interesting, and then I would like to hear what you think, guys. He mentioned about the how natural ecosystems find their climax in the greatest degree of stability it can attain within its given level of possibilities. And then he contrasts that, interestingly, with how social ecologies, or human social ecologies, or human societies that are seem to be pointing towards not to find the greatest degree of stability within their ecological boundaries, but rather to attain the highest degree of freedom and self-consciousness as super added functions of stability. I don't know if he means any social machine at all, but what I find particularly, I find that kind of dynamic specifically within some analysis that I know of capitalist social machine that take all of these previous boundaries and hard embedded codes that limited surplus and growth and all these kind of things in other previous pre-capitalist social machines, and basically displaced all of these codes, all of these social limitations, in a way that creates this kind of, on one hand, which is something that is pretty cool about the capitalist social machine, if there is something cool about it, this decoded social codes that now we can really, there are not many things that we are bound to. Like, we can do so many different things. We can be so many different things that maybe previous social machines didn't have the ability to. Like, you are who you are, and you stay where you were born, and you are part of a particular social order, not because there is like a state that enforces it, but because that's just the kind of codes that grew from the earth together with the society. We don't have those kind of codes, and of course that comes with it all of the issues that we don't have to name here are pretty obvious of what capitalist social machine does. It takes all of these freedoms, but instead of maintaining them as kind of, and maybe this is what he's trying to elaborate here, instead of allowing them to be ecologically emergent, spontaneous freedoms, actual freedoms, it kind of captures them back and turns them into capital. So you can be free, you can do whatever you want, but your dreams and what you aim for and your desires are always sustained only within what is in service of capital, what makes sense for the social machine. Maybe this is what he's trying to elaborate here. So what can we learn from the way freedom is happening within in the ecology that is achieving the highest state of stability within its boundaries? I don't know,
Yeah, I think that's how I understood it in a roundabout way as well, because there's two ways of looking at it also, as far as the stability aspect. From a overarching point of view, society is very unstable. But when you look at the, the working class and what they have to do to remain stable is always in the context of producing for the capitalist colonialist machine. So in a way, it is nature, trying to find that stability, given the level of possibilities. And it's just another way of seeing how humans and the way that we take progress and like the good things and take them too far, right? It kind of evolved, society evolved in a way that that's away from the natural spontaneity when you look at the overarching perspective. And our inside that society, the people themselves, and it's funny that they used the Russian Revolution as the example and communism, because that's always my go-to as well, because it's such a great representation of the people, not society as a whole, trying to find that stability in the context of, a controlling, false narrative that capitalism, colonialism provides. And what they end up doing is starting with really great intentions. And if they don't focus and really check in with concepts that are brought up here in relation to how it all interacts on a greater scheme, you end up getting leaders and movements that have the same roots of the unstable, holistic societal ecosystem. So even though the revolution, was so important and set the precedent for change, it eventually circled back to corruption and misuse of the system that was meant to combat the the oppressive overall system. And I think hubris in social evolution as a danger is as dangerous as it is in natural evolution. I think it's just such an important piece to keep in mind, because I think that a lot of leftist spaces are at risk of making these same mistakes and again evolving within the context of this instability, thinking that they are, you know, striving for that stability, which they are striving for it. They just aren't necessarily seeing the root of the instability in the first place. And I think that that's really what he's getting at, is like, we need to understand how we fit in as a whole, and you know, deconstructing what we do within our like individual, like smaller societies, um, and like reaching that authentic instability on a grander level is the goal. But we have to ask these questions first and really get to that understanding, or we'll just keep, you know, repeating those same mistakes in a different context. And that's why, like, all these rules, right, like that you mentioned, the rigidity, all these revolutions are still working within that context. And until we really take a step back and, like you said, you know, not start fresh, but start fresh in intention of understanding and how we go about achieving the change that we actually want, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, I think this concept of spontaneity is something that he's elaborating pretty beautifully. Um, that I think,
It's just like with the group, you let things evolve naturally, spontaneously.
yeah, yeah. I'm also um, trying to think about in my own personal life how this um, idea of spontaneity, this mode of spontaneity takes place. Like I have, like, what is the, like, maybe there is no need to structure my days, my time, my space. Maybe when I come into relation with my surrounding that is rooted in, on one hand, my realization of deep entanglement and interconnectivity, and on the other hand, the diversity and uniqueness, the particularity, the singularity of the role that I'm playing in it, what naturally emerges, you know, um, what is being created rather than what is I'm creating. And I think a lot of the what we are socialized in the social machine is like to be productive, to structure, to um, make to-do lists, to, um, kind of structure our life. Um, And of course, what is lurking there, like who told us what is structure and good structure look like, right? It's always the social machine. So of course,
Who
the
defined worth and productivity?
yeah, of course, the structure is not like it's always in service of the of what of capital. Um, but I feel like just those very same singularities, these the very ways in which we are conditioned on a very kind of molecular level, is showing up and creating and part of the group, the way that the group think, right? So a revolution starts very spontaneously, very effortlessly, out of the material conditions, and then we are standing there like let's say we took back power or something, or like you know but then we're kind of like sitting there at the climax of the thing, and we're like, oh, we're feeling so uncomfortable in the disorganization or the seeming chaos of the thing, but maybe that is the way, the seeming chaos of things, that through the myriad relational entanglements that exist within that chaos, new becomings are being created, self-emergent. And that's exactly how it should be, not something to fight.
Yeah,
I like to wake up in the morning and just wait until something wants to happen.
yeah, that's and that's exactly kind of what I'm getting at is that um especially like being so entrenched in like New York City and like a society here where everyone's, grinding and all of that. And that type of quote unquote stability, because that's the only way that we as people are able to survive. Um, and that's why he mentions, right, like larger philosophical sense beyond mere survival. But right now, we're just so entrenched in the survival aspect, and that and the imprint of the structure that really started to come about during the Industrial Revolution, where producing really started to take a more significant root in the everyday lives of people, and it translated into every single aspect of our lives, when in reality, like, there aren't any rules. And I think that that's something personally I've always struggled with, still struggle with, but um, in recent weeks, months, I've kind of tapped into that. Like, um, obviously, I still have to do like my responsibilities and stuff, but in general, if I don't want to do something, I just won't. I'll like you said, let something happen versus making it happen. It's just hard, so hard to get to that mental space because we are so centered around production and feeling like we want to be belonging is such an important aspect. And the way that we belong, the way that we feel stability, where stability lies, is in this belonging in and producing and turning our passions into monetary gain. Every hobby becomes a side hustle. Everything is without structure, is encouraged to create structure. And that's why even the revolutions that do happen spontaneously without looking at this larger philosophical sense, we're back into that, you know, rigidity
Yeah.
that is so embedded.
Yeah, we are um, in the same way that we divide man versus nature, we have this divide of the molecular and the molar, or like what's happening on the, let's say, the depth of the bodies, the inner landscape of people, which is where psychoanalysis, therapy, all this kind of stuff, the realm of the inner realm. And then we have like the social stuff, in which we like look at it as like, oh, there is things like ideology and group thinking and like the sociology and so on and so forth. But I think collapsing that difference, collapsing that, and of course they function in different ways, because a collection of singularities in a group functions. It's the collection of all the people who are part of it, or whatever other creatures are part of it. But it's also more than the sum of its parts completely, and it's still made out of all of these singularities. So when we don't examine why we desire what we desire, how we are serving or being, or our desires are directed towards what in the service of capital, then we don't do that in the group as well. And then we end up having a revolution or having a kind of a movement, but end up in the same place. And it's why science and art can be revolutionary. They have the capacity to be revolutionary, but they are not inherently so. Science
Mhm.
has been historically used constantly to be in the service of the state, of capital, of so on and so forth, and so is art. Commercialized and communicated all kinds of things that have served the social machine. Um, so, and neither humans are inherently evolutionary or subversive or part of the machine. We are all processes in bigger processes, constantly plugged into each other and recreating and generating. So, yeah, it's interesting to see all of these things, but in reference to the ecology, and be like, yeah, this is also how ecological systems work.